Oh my goodness, Bayo, it's so good to be with you today. I just want to name that so many of my friends or so many people who I love are on this call, this meeting, and they are angry and jealous that I get to be in conversation with you. But I'm so excited that people can put stuff in the chat and we'll have a yummy conversation together.
Brother.
I'm just so grateful for you and your words and your wisdom and your brilliance. It's just a gift. So excited
Thank
to
you,
see.
brother. Thank you, brother. Likewise, it's a joy to be. Ever since we met, we've been jiving. Did you see my body move this way? It
Yes,
was,
yes.
it was not even like planned or intended. I just felt, yeah, my brother is here. So thank you so much, brother, for your siblinghood.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So we are in this together, and I think one of the things that really moved me, personally, as I was digging into your book, and I have it
yeah,
right in front of me. Oh, you can. These wilds beyond our fences. One of the things that I was so moved by was how you wrote this to your daughter, but also how
yeah,
you brought in like your father and your
yeah.
family in it. And it really brought me to like that I come into this place, I come into this conversation today as the son of Rodney McKenzie, my father,
Huh,
who
yeah.
was deeply a person of faith, deeply troubled in so many different ways, and so loving and so amazing and brilliant. And like that, I am here because of that love that he is, that he was. And I wonder,
Mhm.
I mean, I just wonder how you entered this space. Who are the people that are surrounding you that
Mm,
who you're bringing into this space with us today as a way to kind of bring us all together with our
mm, mm. Well, in no particular order, brother. I am I'm here with my dear wife and partner, who is my grounding force. You know, I have been teaching for a long time. I often teach things. I often find myself teaching things that I have no business teaching. Um, I remember an institute invited me to speak about psychedelics. And I have never um, taken a lick of ayahuasca or anything that remotely resembles psychedelics here. So I'm not even sure where to start. And the reason I say that is because I would traipse off into oblivion if it were not for the grounding force of EJ. She's my anchor. She fastens me to the earth and holds me in place, and I'm grateful for that. So I'm here with her and my kids. Alethea, she was the one I wrote the book to. She doesn't care for it now.
you.
She doesn't want to read it. She thinks it's boring, but that will change. She's in that phase where she rolls her eyes at everything I say, and they're like, "Oh, okay." But we have a beautiful relationship, of course. And my son, he's 7. Alethea is 11, and my son is 7. He's autistic, and he's my prophet.
Mm.
He challenges the my specific claims, my claims to fatherhood, in the sense that he reminds me that I don't have my stuff together, right? That you are not father, you are becoming father, right? This is a journey for you. You will never arrive and win the trophy, and that's fine. Just be here with me. So his body, the way he relates, the way he moves in the world. I often tell the story of him going around in circles, and this ancestral urge comes up in me, and I want to tell him to sit down, right? And this happened in Massachusetts in June. He's walking around in circles. It's 11 p.m. And I want to tell him, could you just sit down while I wash the dishes? Because washing dishes is my most philosophical time. I think the best when I'm in the shower or when I'm washing dishes. right? So I'm doing the dishes. He's walking around in circles. He doesn't want to go to bed. And instead of telling him to go to bed, something transmutates that instruction, that ancestral, intergenerational, parental algorithm transmutates into a question somewhere in my throat. And I
Mm.
find myself saying to him, could you tell me why you walk around in circles? And so it's a question, not an instruction this time. I said, could you tell me why you do this? And without missing a beat, he's chuckling to himself as he goes around in circle. He looks at me and says, Dada, there are things I have to do that you know nothing about. And I will never forget that. So
Mm.
those three particularly, my mother and my sisters are somewhere in the mix, are here with me. But final, but not the least, definitely not the least, is our siblings here on this call. I feel that we are all convening here to meet at the edges of the things we know, especially in these politically charged times when we're being called to migrate, to descend, to ask new questions. These are the invitations that I feel are present.
Wow. Well, thank you for that gift. I love that line, right? The things that you know not. I can't
Yeah,
even.
you know me. You have no clue what I have to do.
I love that. I actually love that. Well, I feel like we're in a moment. I know when we first chatted, this was before the election, and now we're
Yes,
talking after the election. And I know
yes,
that what's on people's minds are like one of the things that hear a lot about is how do we hold this moment that we're in? How do we think about like post-election, post like this moment? How do we hold not knowing, and how do we hold what we think we're going to know? How do we situate ourselves in this moment? And I'm curious, how do you think about it? I know many
mhm,
of us are thinking about it, the election. Some of us thinking about it, Drake or Kendrick Lamar. There's that whole thing, right? There's so many different ways. But like in this moment, like how do you like what are you holding on to? How are you
right.
seeing, experiencing this moment that we're in?
Yes, brother. Um, I was in Minnesota. I was a special guest of McAllister College in Minnesota sometime in October. I visited George Floyd's the shrine dedicated to George Floyd, and this is hosted by the university, the college, McAllister College. And I remember being driven through Minneapolis and realizing in a shock. I knew this theoretically before, but it didn't quite land the way it landed being driven around in that vehicle. That sports is probably the biggest religion in the United States, right? I saw monuments, and I'm from Nigeria. We like our football, what y'all call soccer, you know, which we will never agree to. But we like our football and stuff. But the monuments dedicated to sport, and I was hearing the kinds of budgetary allocations to these monuments, like the stadium, like I was shocked. Billions of dollars, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. I couldn't believe how much, was given to this vocation. And then I heard about what's this? What I forget the name. Is it super? What's it called, brother? The huge one that Kendrick
Super
Lamar is
Bowl.
Super Bowl.
Oh, yeah,
Super
yep.
Bowl. I heard about Super Bowl, and I heard about how cities struggle and wrangle and try to get the hosting rights to these things, and it basically changes the face of the city in the time of the hosting. I heard about some unpalatable things that I could not believe was associated with games, and I could not. This was before the elections. I could not divorce it from the ways that I saw US Americans thinking about the elections, that it seems politics is performed or gamified, at least to my experience coming into the country, gamified as some kind of us versus them kind of thing. It's deeply tribalized. There's no conversation happening. And even more critically, it seems in the very attempt to outwit the other, the one side is resembling the other side, right? It's almost like resistance has become a force of coercion, right? The very attempt to beat the other side, and it was almost like who wins the games when come November, who wins, who comes out on top, and I was and that made me ponder how politics today, brother, seems ill-equipped. That is conventional electoral institutionalized politics seems ill-equipped to meet and host the gestures and the desires of the moment. That we have conflated politics with power. That power is a lot more ecological, a lot more fugitive, a lot more slippery than the performances within the orbit of the nation state that we summarily reduce to power. So my question beyond, and I was contacted by one of the campaigns. I will not mention which campaign, but it wasn't either of the two. It wasn't either of the two, either of the big two, but one of the campaigns reached out. And I remember writing back to them that maybe our addictions to victory um, obscure the other ways we can be in conversation with each other with these times. And maybe that's what I want to say right now, that victory as a commodifying force, as the goal of politics is increasingly toxifying to the possibilities for change and transformation and faith and futures. And I want to have different conversations about how other places of power might look like.
Yeah, I'm so moved by that. I think about my grandmother. I remember Earlene Polk, my grandmother, when I told her at 19 that I was going to be a political organizer. My
Yeah.
grandmother crying, and it shook me because my grandmother taught me that we were supposed to engage in the world and engage in society. And when I told her I was going to be an organizer, that I was going to do politics, she said, "You're going to be one of those people." And I was like, "Oh,
Mhm.
what does that mean?" And she goes, "You're going to be one of those people that knock on my door every 4 years, make promises, and then I'll never see you again until 4 years later." And she said that that is not winning. And it made me
Yeah.
curious, like, what do we understand a win to actually be?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
is this a moment to reimagine or reevaluate the whole premise, like what we're doing, why we're doing it, and the billions of dollars that we're spending, that
Yes.
we better for it, is what I'm sort of.
Yes. Yes. Yes, brother. Yes. You see, the the incredible legacies of Black communities, African communities, Afro diasporic spiritualities seem to mark an invitation to notice the cracks. And in my work, I premise and centralize cracks not as just mere rupture, but where fidelity is misbehaving,
Mm,
where 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 bodies are in performance to a third thing that disrupts the binaries that are so popular and so dominant in our political imaginations. One of the stories I like to tell is about Eshu. British missionaries came to Nigeria and used the name Eshu as the name for the devil. But Yoruba indigenous people insist that Eshu is not the devil, even though I think Eshu would not mind the epithet because he's a trickster and he'll probably be like, let's explore what this new identity looks like. But I digress. One of the powerful stories I continue to centralize in my work is that of the transatlantic slave trade happening, slavers coming, and Eshu sneaking aboard the slave ships. Now, instead of trying to win the battle, which his brother, another Orisha, was trying to do, instead of trying to beat them, to defeat the colonialists, he snuck aboard the ships and traveled across the Atlantic to creolize the world. I've often asked myself if there's any justification for that. But asking for justification amidst ethical erotic flows is to recolonize those transversal flights, right? Is to bring it back to settlement. What Eshu did is not to be reduced in that way. So I think about openings and cracks as invitations for us to notice and to be summoned by and enlisted by these weird fidelities that don't lend themselves to neurotypical ways of seeing the world as binaries. The Democrats defeat the Republicans, Republicans defeat the Democrats, and every 4 years, some monumental figure is elected in the White House, and then we go back to our normative standards. I wonder if politics can do something different. If it's not already doing something different, what might it look like where we accept that all of us are in agonistic fields of tension, where, we are not summarily individuated as we think we are. We are spread out. We are ancestral. We are embedded in cyborgian fields where technology and infrastructure and architecture is already playing roles and pulling on the strings of our bodies. What would it look like where we admit that we're not good citizens, brother? Like the good citizen is such an archetype. Be a good citizen, go to vote. I'm not telling you not to vote. I'm just saying it's an incredibly limited gesture in a time of collapse. And in a time of collapse, I think we're being called to pay attention to other vocations at large. This is what I call parapolitics. Para here the prefix mean sidling, like traveling alongside, but not quite reducible to the highway. Traveling alongside, something supplementary to politics that invites other places of power. That's what I want to say about that for now. Yeah.
I'm like, try not to just like explode on the Zoom, because that was so exciting to me, because it makes me wonder, right? It shifts it from a transactional experience,
Right.
transactional one-time moment that you have to do every couple of years, to a
Yeah.
transformative experience that, like, how do we hold what it means to be in relationship with each
Yes.
other year round, all the time, moment by moment. And I wonder,
Yes.
that's a reshifting or reimagining what it means to be a collective or in community with each other,
Yes.
and the way that we
Yes.
think about it right now.
Yes, brother. Yes. It's that, see, I've said elsewhere that modernity is the historicized attempt to rehabilitate the monstrous. And by the monstrous, I don't mean something pathological. I mean the eruption of things that don't fit within our narratives, our imaginaries, our ideas of ourselves, our ideas of the future. A pandemic, for instance, the monstrous is constantly proliferating. It's not evil in the ways that we predominantly speak about monsters as bad, evil things. No, I use it specifically to name the erotic quality of a world that is never fully itself and is constantly searching, constantly becoming other than what it is, right? This field of the monstrous, what I would call the field of the carnivalesque, right, is often, and maybe one way to enter into this part of the conversation is to notice how we responded to the pandemic, right? The pandemic came. For a long time, since the 70s, we were calling for activism to respond to environmental degradation, to ocean acidification, to climate chaos and collapse. We shook hands, we traveled across the world, we went to Beijing, we went to Rio, we swore to each other, and we cut ourselves in the body and said, we swear that we will give up this addiction to oil and all of that. And then we went right back to it.
Yeah, that's right.
We went right back to it. And then we kept on praying for hope. We kept on praying that something will come that will interrupt our fastidious commitments to destroying our environments. A pandemic came and sent us into our homes. It wandered the streets like a wild god. We weren't sure what to do with it, brother. It took many lives, and it caused a lot of suffering. Yes, but it also did something we were not quite expecting. And in small homeopathic doses, we started to notice that industries were collapsing, planes were grounded, animals were suddenly wandering the street. I'm not saying this is a solution. I'm just trying to say here that a wild God visited us and made us respect our bodies for the first time. Like, give 6 feet between yourselves and behold yourselves with some. I wrote a book. I wrote a small book about this. But the thing is, we quickly got back to what we wanted. We locked this God away, and then we got back, in the ways that Dostoevsky writes about in the Brothers Karamazov, how the church locked up the Christ, right? Because they couldn't stand that he came back. They're like, you're ruining everything for us. Could you just stay put while we perform our churchy business, right? In that same sense, I don't think we are ready for the things we ask for. I don't think we know, like if it hit us in the head, I don't think we would recognize it if it showed up. So maybe we need a politics that isn't about solutions, isn't about products. Obama is a product, right? A manifesto, a blueprint is a product. Maybe it's about process. It's about cultivation without resolution. It's about just being in the moment together and noticing that politics is a multi-species project that is enduringly vaster than our reductionistic attempts to make them an image.
Yes. I'm reminded of Toni Cade Bambara, The Salt Eaters, the opening of the book. I think she says, the first line I think is, "Are you sure, sweetheart, you want to be well?" And
Oh man, I have to write that down.
that line slayed me, right? It's like, let's
Say
be
that,
clear
say that,
about what you're
say that
praying.
book again, brother. Say that book again.
The Salt Eaters, Toni Cade Bambara. I think that's what it's from. But
Okay.
that's the opening line, which is an interesting line around someone coming to a healer, and the first question is, "Are you sure that's what you want?" But the second, I remember having a church, and the thing I would say is that when we pray, you either get two things: what you want, or what's in the way of what you want, as an invitation to
I
be
like that.
to really sit with what you're praying for.
Right.
It may look opposite of what you think it is, but that is actually the answer to your prayer, um, which is kind of unsettling. But it reminds me too of some of what you've also talked about, that I was really moved by too. It's like, what are we expecting? Like this idea of control. Are we really in control of our experiences in our lives? And how do you live? I think what you framed it as the middle. How do you live in that? And I'm curious if
Yes.
you could talk a little bit about that too.
Yes, brother. Well, the middle is such a fascinating space for me. I grew up Christian, and the world, I don't singularly identify as Christian anymore. But I don't believe that, in an entangled world, abandonment is possible, right? Um, Neither do I feel that faith is to be reduced to a doxology or something acquiescence to a list of prepositions. I think I'm still enlisted in these worlds. But I grew up veritably Christian, and um, I kind of divided the world into the world as it was and the afterlife. Right? It was like that song we used to sing. This world is not my home. We're just passing through. We're just going through. It's not this material obfuscatory fleshy realm is just a distraction. The real thing, the platonic thing, is behind the curtain. And I kind of fervently believed in this until my father passed away. And I struggled at the pearly gates and protested, right in front of St. Peter, asking why my father was taken away from me at an early age, demanding to speak with a manager so that he can, at least come to speak with me for a moment. But he didn't. And I guess because I was looking in the wrong place. I was looking in the afterlife, not in the meanwhile. And I started to sense that my father did not relocate behind the binary. He was with me, in a sense. He was in the meantime, he was in the middle. And so the middle became invested, not just the terminal point, but invested with energy and power and agency and possibility. That has led me to reconsider a lot of the things that I was trained to believe and understand as a psychotherapist, as a philosopher, as a professor, that all we need to do is to get to the other side. I no longer consider it that way. One example of a way to think about our bodies in the middle, brother, is to realize, as you have eloquently put it already, that we are not in control. We are not the masters of the realm. We are not the masters of destiny. We are not exclusively independent sovereign beings or automatons just moving across the landscape. We are deeply connected with ecology, with grief. We might think that our feelings, for instance, are ours, that when I have a thought, it's mine. I don't know if anyone has tried here to control your thoughts and how futile that feels, right? For instance, I'm just give a quick example. No one here thinks white elephant. Don't think about a white elephant. Did you, it's like psychology 101 trick. Like we cannot control our thoughts. Thoughts are not human. Feelings, we don't have feelings. Feelings have us. We are enlisted by these things. Psychologists are studying this as embodied cognition, the external mind, experiments conducted to notice that we are enlisted in these atmospheric ecological terrains. And this is very humbling, brother. It reevaluates and reframes politics, agency, accountability, temporality, everything when we start to think from the meanwhile instead of the afterlife or the pre-diluvian.
Whew, I wonder if maybe we all take a breath with that, because that's some yummy stuff. And I think it also speaks to me, Bayo, around an allowing. In the tradition I grew up, we talked about surrendering. Like, what does it mean
Yeah,
to surrender, to allow, to be
yeah,
moved by this experience called life? And
yeah,
just to root myself or root ourselves in this experience, and being rooted in
yeah,
the sense of allowing us to experience all of it, and
yeah,
watching what can come from the allowing, coming from that middle space, is actually kind of
yeah.
profound.
Mm. Allowing, surrendering. I think those are beautiful gestures to try to capture the uncapturable. It's noticing that there's something else here in the room. A dear sister of mine will call that prior generosity. A prior generosity. That is, we don't always have to finish our sentences because the village finishes our sentences for us, right? There's a generosity that is occluded by the scarcity of modernity. So maybe I want to emphasize that we don't have to get there. When I speak about entanglement and prior generosity and what I call post-activism or ontofugitivity and all these concepts that suggest that, quite critically, for instance, we are not the center of knowing. That we often think we are knowers and we know the world. And I'm trying to say that knowing does not happen with the spider. It happens in the web,
Mm.
right? Knowing is an ecological assemblage. I have a theory called ecological assemblage theory that just it softens the politically weaponized edges with which we blame the other for not doing their own research. Like, do your research, do the work. There's something that is modernizing and deeply colonizing about the centralizing of the individual and the cutting off of the individual from the ecological conditions that make the individual possible. which is the reason I insist that the left and the right are part of the same edifice, right?
Yes.
They may not believe the same things. And that is quite secondary to how bodies work. That both of us could disagree about many things and could still be part of the same assemblage, sustaining the same kinds of realities. So the content of your belief isn't quite my palaver here. It is, what are we sustaining in our postures? What geometry of experience beyond the content? What is the form that is sustained by our, antagonism here? But I've traipsed off from what I was going to say. I can't even remember what I was going to say, brother. Yeah, you were
I love
saying.
that. What you said though, where you got me. That was good because I think what I experienced though with you, Bio, is like it's actually a posture of being amazed.
Yes.
It's a wonderment. It reminds me of the Taoist would say, a name that can be named is not the name. A way that can be walked is not the way. Tao,
Yes.
both named and nameless. So there's
Yes.
like which is so
Yes.
challenging for a belief that we can control or name or hold it or shrink
Yes.
it to what we can understand.
Yes, brother. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
it almost forces me to ask, is even us saying this is the end, is that limiting the
Yeah.
possibility of what the
Yeah.
end?
Absolutely, I think so. I do think so. This is, in Christian traditions, there was one way to think about Christian traditions, for instance, is to notice the historicity of cataphatic versus apophatic traditions. The cataphatic folks believed fervently in exploring and saying what God is. God is good, God is bad, whatever you want to say, as long as there is a positive thing to say, positive not in terms of advantageous or complimentary, but as long as you can say anything about the sacred, that is cataphatic, right? But the apophatic folks felt that when you apophatic, meaning literally means not saying, right? I will not say, right? It's like we move closer to the mystery by not saying that this is basically what you just said, by not trying to nail things down. And there's some deliciousness to that. One of the reasons why I think of myself not so much as an academic, as a philosopher, and not so much as a philosopher as a public intellectual, and not so much as a public intellectual as a thinker, and not so much as a thinker as I would think of myself as a poet,
Mm,
right? And maybe not even that. Maybe I'm just in awe.
mm,
I'm just flawed by the what my dear sister Erin Manning will call autistic perception, where people might see categories. I want to see flow. I see flow. I see how things melt into each other, how entrainments happen, fluids and their compositions create unexpected, surprising realities, right? And that is for me the reason why I cannot long abide the strong edges and the um, rarefied lines we draw in the ground to distinguish or to say this is you and this is me, and never the twain shall meet. I'm already in touch with how the twain are already deeply relational. So this is process philosophy. This is process theology. This is noticing that things do not exist. It's relations that exist. And it is from relations that thinginess comes, right? And only for a short while, right?
mm. Yeah, I'm so moved by that. I think about I think about a Course in Miracles that talks about that the premise for me over and over again is that all of this we've made up, like the names, the way that we understand it, we have made it up.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
happens if we allow ourselves the room to just be with it
Yes.
and experience it and the beauty of it?
Yes. Biologists don't know how to describe life, right? It's one of the fascinating things. Like biologists, are struggling, and I read a paper recently about how do we define life. You would think that the people who study life know how to describe it. You would think that Sam Altman, the new messiah of AI,
Mm.
right, would be able to answer a point blank question like, so tell us how it is that ChatGPT responds in this way to these questions. And Sam confesses, none of us know, right? You would think that the engineers who built these systems from the bottom up would describe how these things work. It's the idea that the more we try to capture the world, the more it slips away from view. And this is what I call ontofugitivity, that the world is too promiscuous to abide faithfully to any one description of it, any one ideology of it. And that is such a humbling thing. It's the very heart of decoloniality, that where the slaver or the colonial master plants a flag and says, I have arrived, the ground beneath him says, I'm not quite sure,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Because I'm already long gone.
Mm. I love that. Yeah, I love that. I feel like that's also the gift of I think, uh, our trans siblings who are pushing up against this idea.
Yes,
What do we even mean by gender? Like, what does that
yes,
mean? What are these
yes,
constructs? What if we explode all of this and allow
yes,
people to be who they are and
yes,
express that is so much bigger than the binaries that we consume?
yes, yes.
Mm.
I'm writing a piece about gender. The name of the essay is called Wolf. I'm not going to disclose that because I hear spoilers are a thing or a sin in the global north. In the global south, we don't care. But in the north, that's a thing. So I'm not going to spoil what this essay is about. But right in the essay, I make the claim that bodies don't have gender, right? It's not a property of an individual self. It's that gender is a multi-species, ecological, atmospheric vocation. And, to reduce bodies to a binary, misses out. It's another cataphatic attempt to nail God down, right? It's another cataphatic attempt to colonize and to situate bodies as if they were still, instead of migrancies moving and constantly being made. However, brother, and this is probably not where our conversation is going, but we just want to play with it. I feel the political champions trying to support that thesis are doing a lot of harm to it,
Mm.
right? The political left, in its attempt to advance this position along the highways of progress, inadvertently um, put it back in the family way, reposition it within the orbit of normal normative experience, right? That is something very. It's like trying to capture an explosion,
Yeah.
right? Well, you want to capture the explosion. Something is exploding, but immediately you name it and you insist that unless you abide by this name, then and call me by this name, which is important to do. But unless you do so, then you are in vocations of harm. But this is where Yoruba teachings come in. That in an explosion, you need the trickster, not the leader, right? Not the hero, not the champion with the sword. You need ways of slippage. You need um, technologies of leakage, technologies that are alive to how things are spilling. If you try to, this is what African bodies learned the hard way, right? That once we achieved victory in the African independence movements and we chased away all our colonizers, we said, yay! And then we turned around and we saw that we had become the very thing we chased away. We had flags, we had a throne, we had a constitution, and we had the codependence on the IMF, right? It's that thing that in the very attempt to resist the colonial, we often become the very colonial thing we're trying to resist. So that's why the trickster is the other archetype that invites us to spill, to do other things that is not available to the political left and the political right to do. Parapolitics.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I'm gonna take that. We're gonna take that one in. That's really, really profound. One of the things that we talked about, Bayo, is like three ideas that we wanted to kind of
Yes.
take out, right? So one is faith, the other one
Mm-hmm.
is imagination, and the third
Mm-hmm.
one is power, right? So faith
Yes.
and power. And
Yeah.
and I feel like we hit some faith. I feel like we really got into some faith pieces, and I really, really appreciated one of the things that I was sitting with is I think you mentioned um, that to sit with a hush. I'm reading one of your
Okay.
sit with the
Yeah.
hush is to meet oneself as if for the first time. It is
Yes.
to come home, and this coming home is why I write to you. And
Yes.
I was so moved by this idea of sitting with this hush, meeting
Yes.
oneself for the first time, and this
Yeah.
notion of coming home. And I'm curious, like, what is that, this notion of coming home? How do you think about that? How do you hold that? And how is that related to this notion of faith as well?
Mm, mm. Ah. Well, the first thing I would say for people who haven't read the book, it's been 7 years. I've been feeling like I was Christopher Nolan with a secret about the movie I just made, and I'm not going to tell everyone what that scene is. It's been 7 years since this book came out. I might as well just share it because I constantly get letters saying I've looked online for these insects, these critters you described. Could you tell me the Latin name for it so that I can, people take things very literally. A hush is an unnameable apophatic thing. And it's supposed to disturb the Western mind and the Western addiction to naming. By Western, I don't necessarily mean the Western Hemisphere, because the global South is increasingly part of the West. Um, and so I'm trying to disrupt the ways we try to fix the world in place, to categorize it, to make it legible by all means. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But yes, brother, the your question again, brother. I think I moved. You were speaking about faith, no?
Yeah, faith and thinking about this coming home.
Coming home. Yeah. Uh, the reason I mentioned the hush is to say something about homecomings that again the trickster turned on its head. I visited the Door of No Return in Ghana with a few brothers of mine, Orland Bishop, Resma Menakem. We're filming a documentary last year called Three Black Men. And I stood at that threshold. I remember looking out into the Atlantic, just taking it in and really appreciating the vocation of the trickster. Because these bodies were spirited away from home, brother. They were taken away from language, from culture, from belonging, from spirituality. I think one of the reasons why Eshu traveled with them was to disturb the idea that home is that which you depart or that which you're taken away from. It could be that home is the strange thing you don't know yet, right? That and Edouard Glissant, the Afro-Martinican philosopher, speaks about, the three dangerous and poisonous things, that accompany that journey is the terror of being stripped away from home, is the terror of the journey itself, that wooden incarceration that often led to suicides. But it's also the terror of approach and not knowing what comes next. But in that terror, in that third thing lies the hidden promiscuous promise that there is something available, something else, even within the boats of carcerality. There's something awaiting if only we had the postures that are attuned to these weird fidelities. So what I'm trying to say, brother, is we often think about home as that original thing we left behind. And I'm trying to say that home, if you think about in some of the ways that indigenous knowledge systems are being co-opted as, as these magical things that will save us all, right? Like the ways that the magical Negro was a trope. Like if he shows up, he'll solve all our problems. The way that indigeneity is treated today, like, oh, only if we go back to the way things were, would we restore harmony in the universe? And I'm saying, hold it a little bit. The idea that of going back in itself is a colonial temporality. Like time doesn't work that way either. Like the past is yet to come. It's not that we go back to an image that is stable, just waiting for us to return to it. It's that the world is moving. Like Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian author, says, give me a place to stand and I shall move the earth, is what the impatient idealist says. But there is no place to stand. The earth moves and we must move alongside with it. So home moves, home migrates, home travels. And I think it's time to travel, brother.
Wow. Wow. And I'm, as an Army brat, as someone who grew up in the military and we moved all the time, it troubled my understanding of what home actually meant.
Yes. Yes.
Troubled.
Yes.
And it's interesting to think about how I think it's this modern conception of control. And
yes.
What it to be controlled in this moment.
Yes. 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 Yes.
Well, I'm curious too, then, one of the curiosities is around the power of imagination and the role
Yes,
of Emily Towns, Black womanist theologian, talks about that one of the ways that we are attacked, one of the ways that evil is constructed is actually by stripping us away from our imagination, our ability to imagine new worlds. And I wonder, how do you think about imagination and the need for imagination in these moments and the role of imagination?
Yeah. I mean, imagination can perform a territory. I've been speaking about things a concept that I call dis-entrepreneurship. I'm not going to get into the weeds about what I mean by that, but I have been critiquing our commitments to new things, like to the new, right? Or to innovation. That concept of innovation holds a lot of modern burdens and anxieties about the future. We want to innovate our way out of climate chaos, out of racial injustice. Innovation, innovation, innovation. And innovation is how we think about the new. But the new, brother, could be a perceptual regime, that a prison of some kind, what Foucault called the panopticon, right? It could be our addiction to particular sensorial attributes or ways of being in the world. Think about if I showed you my very tired phone and I said this phone is new, you'd probably not think it's new. It doesn't have the new smell. There's no peeling off. It doesn't have the new experience, right? There's something about the new that is so ritualized in modernity. And I think imagination works the same way, that imagination could become some kind of perceptual sensorium where we pass along images, anticipatory modalities, expectations, rituals, ceremonies. And by ceremonies, I don't mean something exotically indigenous. I mean brushing your teeth. Something as simple and mundane as having a meal is a ritual, right? That forms a sensorium, an imagination, an imaginal field. What we are suggesting, or what I'm suggesting through my work, is that imaginal field is creatively exhausted. If the height of our politics is to imagine another leader in 4 years, okay, if this person looks more like me, perhaps, if that's the height of imagination, then you can see we're just passing along the same energy around the room. That is why I look for cracks and openings. And the crack in the sensorium is where we're exhausted, is where we fail, is where we do not measure up. But we hide these things, right? It's just like, I don't know if you've read Kafka. and his metamorphosis, right? Where the salesman becomes a bug. I think we're all becoming bugs. We're all sprouting monstrous fungal entities from our armpits. We just know how to hide them. we know how to hide them and put the perfume and go out and move along and keep calm. I'm saying it's time not to keep calm. A parapolitics is specifically composed of not keeping calm, sharing our grief. It's about sitting with each other and saying, guys, I have another head growing out of my armpit. It's not comely to look at, but please, is there space for making sanctuary for this thing here? That's what I mean by making sanctuary, not keeping ourselves safe. Safety in a time of migration, safety in a time of genocide, safety in a time of anthropocenic effects can be a form of incarceration in itself. And this is not to diminish the need for protection, but it is to notice that even that is limited. We have to become something different. This is a time for phase shifting, brother. And phase shifting is already an attribute of imagination, or how imagination becomes other than what it is.
So I can hear voices in my head. I can hear like one of my colleagues who would say, so then what, how do we do that? What do we do? Like, how do we live and be excited about the cracks, those open
Yes. Yes.
in societies that are often capitalistic, that are
Yeah.
addicted to this notion of modernism and the way that is it like, so then how do we hold that? How do we
Yes.
lead on that?
Yes, brother. Um, uh, I read recently about mothers in Gaza um, doing something that made me tear up a little. That as the bombs land, they have learned to use those moments they have created games with their children from those terrible moments, so that they now use video games and earphones, around their children's heads to play games, especially to numb out the noise of bombs landing in their communities. That isn't a response to these efforts, these apartheid-like gestures, but it is, in my view, a noticing of what Deleuze, Guattari, Erin Manning, Brian Masumi, and myself might call a minor gesture. The minor gesture is all the hidden tendencies within a system, all the hidden potentialities for transformation that are already embedded in the system, not outside of the system in the ways of let's pull down capitalism and see what happens. No, it's that right there within the slave ship is a trickster. Within capitalism are other heterogenetic moves, other kinds of gestures that are not majoritarian. They may not look like Obama having a handshake with the Pope, promising to get rid of climate chaos once and for all, but it's all the ways, all the tiny ways, like a grandmother in Rio de Janeiro cooking for black people just coming into our compound, and slowly samba music starts to form just by sitting with each other, and samba music starts to become this decolonial force. Right? It's all the small ways that we notice that solutions may not be what we look for now. Right? And I wish I had time to stretch it out, but that's what the course is about. That's what I'm constantly working with people to think through, that not to get rid of the solutionistic, but to notice that solutions may perpetuate the logic of the problems we're trying to exile our bodies from.
Yo, I'm like, I mean, it is, I mean, and I think the beauty of it again is it is a ministry of presence, a ministry of like fully embracing this moment now and being
Yeah.
with it.
Yes. Yes, brother. being with it, sitting with the trouble, right? And that is not a remark or an exclamation of distant armchair philosophical gestures. It's that this is a matter of life and death, and then some.
Yeah.
That there is more in the room than our philosophies and our theologies have made space for. Our justice movements, our activisms have been committed to making room, right? Inclusion, DEI, more space at the table. Fine. However, I think it is time to make sanctuary. Making room is not enough, because putting more bodies in a house that is collapsing is not exactly the kind of forward thinking that people might, pride themselves in participating in. The house is no longer capable of hosting more. I want to join others in making sanctuary, and not making sanctuary is paying attention to the hidden gestures, putting your hand on the cave walls beneath a 42,000-year-old problem, right? And listening for, the ways that the world often changes is to send cracks into spaces, right? I often say that when things get too rigid, cracks are the first responders. When things get too solid, too ossified, cracks are how, the universe assures us that even the solid is fluid. It's still changing. So
Yeah.
occupying the cracks
Mm,
is powerful.
mm. Yeah, I'm sitting with my mom 2 years ago passed away of brain cancer. And I
Mm,
remember that a lot of my friends would say this thing of, well, they were so broken hearted, like, but your mom prayed, your mom was so holy, your mom was all these things. And what I remember experiencing is my mom's presence with that moment that taught me
mm,
about living in a way that I had never experienced before. Like, what does it mean to live in your body in moments of breaking, in moments of like like um heartache and heartbreak and pain, but there was a way in which she lived that taught me that maybe our understanding of life and living is too limited. It's too based on this idea of wellness that we need to explode, that we
mhm,
and it made me
mhm,
think about, I loved in your book, you said there's this line about that we are a constant falling apart of becoming
mhm,
us. And I wonder if you
mhm.
can, I wonder if you can share a little bit about what that means for us in this moment and how we live with that understanding.
A constant falling apart. Yeah. Um, and that the constancy of that falling apart is not a pure ontology. It's the falling apart always already includes a putting ourselves together, and then a falling apart, and then a putting ourselves together ad infinitum, right? It's how bodies cohere and dissipate and come together and explore new forms. um, Perhaps no other person in biblical literature exemplifies this falling apart than Job, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And I grew up really battling with the story of Job, and Job is a prime example of a theodicy, which is a theology of suffering or pain that hosts questions like, why does God permit suffering? Whatever you name as God, why does suffering exist? And I have tackled that question. I actually did so in the book as well, where Job lives by the book. He does everything right, and then all this suffering befalls him, and then he marches to court and says, "I lived by the book. I obeyed the laws. I did not, cross the road at the wrong place. I paid my bills. I paid all the taxes. What happened? What happened here?" And then God starts to respond like a drunken psychotherapist, right? Doesn't quite address the issue, but starts to speak about, hey, notice my my certificate on the wall. I graduated Harvard in 1997. Did you know, like, God started to speak about Pleiades and the constellations and like, hey, see what I did with the deer and stuff like that. And that always bothered me. Like I would scream and like, just tell the man something, right? Just give the man what he wants, a bomb solution. Just tell him. And it occurred to me that the that the reason, we're addicted to the God of the answer, right? The God of the solution, right? Or the God of the right question. I'm quite fascinated by the God of ecstasy, by the God of by the God that notices that the question or the answer isn't exactly what you need, that you're too limited within your frameworks that secrete these bodies of anxiety to notice what the world is doing. It was as if God was actually saying, take a walk and look at a leaf. It was a very materialist, animist vocation. Like, notice a tree and notice how you're not all that. Right? If I gave you the answer, it will not address your fidelities, the things you're committed to in a corporeal fashion. As a psychotherapist, I know that in my bones. You could speak with someone who is, in the normal parlance of clinical psychology, addicted to something. You could give that person information and say, if you continue to do this thing, it will harm your life. You could die from it. And a person receives all this information and says, I get it. I understand it. In fact, I agree with you 100%. But because we are not our own, because we belong to assemblages, brother, and we come from assemblages, we're not in control in that way. So it might just be that you understand all the details, you have the blueprint, and still realities don't shift. So I think God's invitation to Job was there's something more powerful than the answer to the question. And that is ecstasy. That is standing beside yourself. Literally, the meaning of ecstasy is to stand beside the static and to notice yourself for the first time.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. I'm going to go to some of the questions that are coming up in the chat box. I see Pamela writes, you mentioned the three poisons. What would you say about the relation to passion, aggression, and ignorance in the Buddhist cosmology?
Oh, I know little about the Buddhist cosmology, sister or sibling. I'm not exactly sure how to frame that. But could you say the question again? Let me see how it lands again. Passion, aggression, and what else?
You mentioned the three poisons. What would you say about the relation to passion, aggression, and ignorance in the Buddhist?
Okay. Well, I cannot speak for or competently about that tradition. But I think I can understand what you're asking here. That maybe those are things within that tradition that are possibly vilified as things you want to get rid of. Like the more passionless you are, the more free of aggression you are, then the more available for the higher things, the higher order things you become. I think that tradition is trying to, and I don't want to speak summarily in a way that is totalizing, but speculatively, the presuppositions, the prepositions, propositions that tradition is working with have to do with how to address our imbrications with affect, and to notice that sometimes we are summoned by affect. By affect, I mean not just emotionality or feeling, I mean the capacity to be in response with. And that sometimes we get summoned or, enlisted in a place or in a zone or in a space. And the thing you want to do is to be alive to them, right? So maybe what it names as getting rid of passion is maybe a form of passion, and attending to passion as if it were not a property of ours, but another force, something that we should respect as not ours. So maybe not a negation of passion, but a staying with these things. It's just in the same way that too much of meds of a cure can poison, like, and yet a little poison can become curative. A little poison can cure. Maybe that's the same sense here. But yes.
Wonderful. Here's another question. There's a comment and a question. I'm going to just read the question.
Okay.
That as much as we want to flee from having to name things,
Yeah.
categories and names gives us something. Your documentary, Three Black Men, for example, there's something about blackness and maleness that seems important enough to name. Where and how can we approach trying to avoid the language of drawing a line, name
Yes.
identity in a way that allows us to name ourselves in the way we want to, but doesn't fall into the trap of trying to be the hero, the leader that you spoke of?
There you go. So naming things is not something we can avoid, right? Language in itself is already a form of violence, right? There's no escaping that form of settlement building. Every body is a vocation in naming, whether you use words or not, is a territorializing process, right? We're not against naming. We're noticing the risks and the limitations of naming things at all. With blackness, for instance, if you read some of the stuff that I'm putting out there, I distinguish between blackness with a big B and blackness with a small b. I name blackness with a big B, this identitarian commitments to speaking truth to power, to finding space within white modernity. It comes from right down, the history of bodies brought from Africa. All of that is part of this vocation of naming ground for ourselves and saying we belong here too. We will have a space for ourselves. But the thing is, I'm losing my desire to have a room on the Titanic. That's basically what I'm trying to say. That I don't just want another room on the Titanic, given that the Titanic is, haunted by its own future. I want to leave. I want a blackness that knows how to fly, that knows how to do other things. So the small B blackness is not identitarian, it's minoritarian, it's molecular, it's how bodies become each other. It may not be an immediately obvious name to people just coming into this discourse, but it works in my vocation to name it in that way and to suggest that category seeking is how coloniality works most of the time. But being able to slip between categories is how fugitivity works. Blackness as fugitivity is what I try to sing into poetics.
It's beautiful.
Yes.
Here's another question that got a heart. So it's radiating. What guidance do you have to DEI practitioners working in broken systems? What is your thoughts on how to stay motivated while navigating incremental change?
That if we get an equal piece of a carcinogenic pie, we're still in the same trouble. If we get an equal piece of a carcinogenic pie, a cancer-causing pie, then we're still in the same geometry of experience, right? As deeply as I respect, and then I need to say this, I come from a racially monolithic society, Nigeria. Wakanda is famously modeled after my country, right? Right, it's the blackest nation on earth. We're all black. I'm acutely anonymous in Nigeria. The reason I say that is because anytime I step into the United States, I literally feel something different. It's like my body curls up, and this right from the border, right from the moment I feel I have to perform my degrees and assure the people at the border that I'm one of the good ones. right? I may never voice it this way to them, but I feel my body doing this. Like, I'm good. I have a PhD, I have two PhDs. Is it okay if I come in? So I understand, and I couldn't. Maybe what I'm trying to say is that I couldn't even begin to understand what it means to live there, to live and grow up there, as a body that looks like mine. I cannot even begin to speak to it.
Mm.
So there's no dismissing those gestures, of seeking diversity and equity and inclusion. The gift of living in my country and being trained in Yoruba spiritual traditions is that I am able to speak to the limitations of that vocation. That I
Mm.
find myself noticing that, hey, the way this has worked is to keep the architecture of power stable while changing the content, right? It's that, hey, we will, it's what Harry Belafonte, is it Belafonte? Yeah, said to Martin Luther King when Martin Luther King was partying in his house, and Martin Luther King was sad, and Harry came to him and said, hey, why are you sad? And Harry was like, and Martin was like, we got all the legislation we needed. 1964 happened. We're getting all the legislation. Things are looking up. But why do I have this sense that we're integrating into a burning house? Right?
Well,
We're integrated into a burning house. It's the same thing. Getting an equal piece of a carcinogenic pie is still the same math. The transactionality is still present, right? I don't want the quid pro quo of justice. I think something beyond justice, something beyond the public order is inviting us to lose our way. That's why the Yoruba people say, until you lose your way, you will not see it.
mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm. That's beautiful. I think we have time for another question.
Right.
And someone's asking, Mimi, I stand in the parapolitical middle, noticing the assemblages and the explosions, seeking the cracks and wisecracks from Trickster as I allow things to flow in me and allow myself to flow. What is my guide for where we flow to?
Mm. I love that phrasing, the parapolitical middle. And folks, middle does not mean like, because language is very beguiling, right? Middle is like, oh, you're telling us that we should be independent. No, no. I think my sibling there is speaking poetically, beautifully in the language of Glisson, of a middle that is already the edge, the middle that is the entire territory, is noticing that we cannot risk the binaries of our times if we are to chance upon new kinds of futures, and new not in terms of innovative, but at least different differences. I don't know how to offer, and I'm not sure if this is what you're asking. I may have misheard, but I don't know how to offer a way. Um, I offer a brief story, and I briefly alluded to it when I spoke about 42,000 years ago, when, according to scientists studying trees in New Zealand, there was a cataclysm of some kind 42,000 years ago. And Neanderthals and a proto-human population went underground because the sky started to burn. Solar flares came in. It was a polar shift of some kind. And therein, descending into the caves, which later anthropologists suggest might explain the springing up of art, cave art, almost at the same time everywhere across the world, right? They started to put their hands on walls. They started to press their fingers, their palms, and make art in the darkest places. I call that endarkenment, not enlightenment. It's just like in the darkness of the dark, in the deep, they started to make art. Making art is not a solution, it's not a fix, but there's something about being in that place of descending where perception is misbehaving, where our bodies are migrating towards the cracks, where we're losing our, modular mastery, the functions that have been given to us by our modern citizenry, where we're falling apart, that's the place of making art. That's the place of speaking with each other. Maybe it looks like cooking with each other. Maybe it looks like grieving together. Maybe it looks like having residencies where we just live with each other. Maybe it looks like making sanctuary around my son. Maybe it looks like not telling my son to sit down and realizing that something deeper than my instruction is happening as he walks around in a nameless circle. Like the cracks don't have names. Cracks cannot be, monsters can be rehabilitated, but not cracks. I just want to say that they're showing up everywhere these days and have always been showing up. How to identify them is always speculative, but gather folks, bring community together, and sit with those things that modernity disallows you from having. Maybe it's your failure to show up, or maybe it's your failure to be a successful person. Those are the cracks, the openings where I think if we stayed long enough, we might be visited by stranger kinds of perception that might bequeath and bring about a new kind of world.
That's profound. That's profound. It's yeah, that's absolutely profound. And so I'm seeing so many questions around the how, and I think you've really given us
I know. But like, give it to us now
yeah.
in 1, 2, 3 steps. It's.
But I think what I think that the gift of, like, I love the endarkenment, right? Profound.
Right.
Um, the gift of being with it is actually the ability to hear something that will shake you and
Yeah.
hear something and experience something that is profoundly different, right?
Yes.
So I can
Yes.
think about, when my mom passed, I was in my apartment, didn't know she passed, and I had this feeling, this experience of something speaking. And what I heard was, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't
Mm,
know that your whole life you were looking for me to say I loved you, and I've
mm,
always loved you. And that
mm,
moment was so healing. And it was
mm,
a moment of transition that shifted my idea of what it means to be physically present with someone. And it changed
mm,
the whole orientation of life. And I just
mm.
wonder how sometimes the how is in the being able to be with, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
the presencing of our lives, being with the questions
Yes.
actually provides the openings that bring more questions that we get to
Yes.
live, you know.
Yes, brother. That is a beautiful story and way to just think about this. As a writer, I know I am not the author. That might sound contradictory, but I've learned slowly over the years that I am not the author. I do a lot of, I've planned for a book for 3 years and didn't write the book. I was planning for that book, like start to write this book, and I got all the research materials together. But it's like in the planning, I never saw the book, and then I looked around and I noticed that right there, the minor gesture was right in the midst of planning. The book was already emerging. It was already writing itself and recommending itself to my senses. Right. This is the idea that the how does not precede the what, right? We often think there's a stable how, and all we need to do is lay claim to it, and then the what will emerge when we practice this how. It's that the how and the what are still emerging. And that is probably humbling and also terrifying because we want to think that the world is already populated by the things that we must do. But what if the world is teenage and it's awkward and it's still emerging? And what if the world is still asking as well, then what do we do? Like our African stories from Kemet, ancient Egypt, tell us that the gods too were asking, what do we do about this moment? So I think we are figuring it out together, but we are at the ecotones of a threshold And this threshold is teaching us a new kind of posture, not the posture of rectilinear heroism, not the posture of the leader who blazes a path forward without prejudice to all these archetypes, but the posture of bowing, the posture of worship, where worship is not necessarily entangled with an institution, but is an invitation for us to fall apart together so that we might notice ourselves as if for the first time.
Mm. Yo, you know it's good when I say yo. Wow, that's profound, and thank you for that gift.
Thank you,
Um,
Rob.
and I know we are hitting time, and I think that for so many folks, I'm seeing they want more questions. They have more questions, and I think this is a great opportunity to be a part of your course that you're doing. It's a
Yeah.
online course for like there's 4 sessions, and there's an in-person retreat. It's in the chat. I don't know if you want to say anything, Bayo, about that experience.
Not really. I'm hungry, but I'm feeling very hungry now. But yeah, this is the vocation of the public intellectual, and I'm. If you feel enlisted, then come. But this was supposed to be a taste of some kind. Not that when you come, you will find the answers. I have no clue what the answers are. There's no guru here or anywhere within my locality. Instead, we are co-researchers in a world that is still emerging. Let's do this together. That's all I'll say.
Well, Christina has put in chat that we're looking for a DJ. There's going to be a dance party at this experience with you. We're going to have
Yeah.
a dance party.
Okay.
Who's
Okay.
going to
Yeah.
DJ? But
This,
Bayo, thank you so much for this like really moving and profound conversation. And big thanks to the Garrison Institute for
thank
bringing
you.
us together for this conversation. I have so much gratitude and thanks for this conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, brother. And thank you, everyone. Thank you.